Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 24. Chapter 24 takes us to Australia and it introduces a very famous sailor, Captain Cook. So let's get started. Who was Captain Cook? Well, Captain Cook was a very famous sailor for his discoveries and mapping around the Pacific region and the Pacific Ocean. So famously, during the 7 Years' War, on behalf of England, he went around the coast of modern-day Canada and mapped it so that the British could easily find Quebec. Now, along with mapping out Canada, he's very famous for all of his mapping out and discoveries for Europe along the Pacific Ocean in different islands and even in Australia. So let's get started with one of his most famous missions. One of his most famous missions was actually a double mission. His first mission and primary one was to go and observe Venus as it passed over Earth. Now, this celestial, so space event, wasn't going to be able to be seen from England. So the scientists in England decided that they were going to send Cook, who was familiar with the Pacific Ocean, to Tahiti. On the island of Tahiti, they would be able to well see and observe and take note about this celestial event. Now, there was also a second secret mission. There was a sealed envelope with instructions for him to go and open them after he finished mapping Venus. So 10 months later, they were in Tahiti and the mission was completed with the Venus mapping. So Cook opened his envelope for his secret second mission. Now, the secret second mission, he was to go down south and find the famous great southern continent and claim it for England. Now, a lot of people in Europe believe that there must be a great southern continent that would balance out all the weight of the north part of the planet, which was filled with land that they were aware of. So they were sure that in order for the planet to not tip over, it had to have some kind of amount of equal land mass down in the southern hemisphere. So that was Cook's mission. So he set off in search of this great southern continent. And on his journey, I have it mapped here in blue, he actually came down and went around New Zealand. And he marked all the coastline and mapped it. And then he noticed some mountains to the west. And so he sailed west and he went around the coast of Australia. Now, the first stop he made was in an area called Botany Bay, marked right there. And in Botany Bay, he discovered so many unique and interesting plants that he had never seen before or heard of. So he decided to give it the name Botany Bay, botany being the study of plants. And then he moved on with his travels and went around the coast of Australia, mapping it, and headed back to England to report his discoveries. So here we see all of this back to England. Now, 1 year later, he went back to Botany Bay and the Great Southern Hemisphere and decided to go south to see what else was there. And he actually went to Antarctica and he noticed that it was just ice. And so there was no real great southern continent. If there was, it would just be Australia. He also decided to name Australia New South Wales because it reminded him a lot of the land he had seen in Wales, which is next to England. So now to him, Australia was that great southern continent. So now what? He's discovered Australia, he's discovered New Zealand, he's mapped it all out. What next? Well, he decided it was time to finally answer the question, was there a Northwest Passage? Remember, all the explorers from Columbus on, they were sure that there would be a passageway that would go through North America and lead them directly to China. So Cook decided he would try this mission one last time. But this time, he was going to start from the west coast of North America, from the Pacific coastline. So he went up and he looked and he couldn't find anything. And so he finally decided that there was no such thing as the famous Northwest Passage. On his way back down to New Zealand, he needed to stop in Hawaii to restock his ship. Now, there's a lot of things that happened on Hawaii. Hawaii would be the last island Cook ever visited. But what happened exactly is questioned by historians. Different historians have different ideas. But the most common idea was that when Cook arrived, the Hawaiians thought that he was their god Rono. And Rono was very famous for being the god of happiness. So they wanted to treat him well. They treated him and his crew well. They fed them well. They, helped them. And then it was time for Cook to go. So Cook said bye, and they ended peacefully. But when he left Hawaii, he was quickly caught in a storm at sea, and it damaged his ship greatly. So he had to go back for repairs. When he went back, the Hawaiianers were not happy to see him again. They thought that he was being greedy. They had just given him so much food, so many of their resources. They treated him so well. He has come back for seconds. They thought this was greedy, and they decided to take some things from the ship, Cook's ship. Now, Cook was like, hey, my stuff, give that back. But the native peoples didn't want to do that. So Cook decided, if I catch the king, I can hold him hostage and demand my stuff back. So that's what he did. But as he captured the king and was taking him back to the ship, one of the young islanders hit Cook in the back of the head with a club and instantly saw that he was bleeding. Gods don't bleed. So this must not be a god. He must be a human. And he was taking their king. So they all gathered and killed Cook. And that was the end of Captain Cook. Now, that isn't the end of this chapter. This chapter continues to go on with what happened now that England had claimed Australia. Well, at the same time that everything was happening at Hawaii, North America, we just had America specifically become its own country. And so now that America was its own country, it was no longer going to accept British prisoners. You see, in the colonies, the most southern one is Georgia. It's the one that's right above the Spanish colony of Florida. And Georgia used to be where they sent all their prisoners in England because their jails were too full. So they would send them to Georgia, force them to work hard on those plantations and farming, and then eventually they would earn their freedom and get to come back to England. Now, America said, we're a country. We don't need you. We don't want your prisoners. Get out. So they needed to find a new place for all these prisoners. There was still no room in England. And finally it hit them. Let's take them to New South Wales. So they sent 11 ships and the captain, Arthur Phillip, to Australia in order to set up a new colony for their prisoners. Now, Arthur Phillip was determined to make sure that this colony was successful. However, when he got there, there was not a lot to start with. First, he landed in Botany Bay, but it was too swampy, so he moved them over down the coast to a new cove, which he named Sydney Cove. And even though they found a new place that wasn't swampy, their tools that they brought to chop down trees were not used to these hard, thick trunks of the trees in Australia. They were not used to this land, so they struggled a lot and almost starved their first time. Now, ships did come and bring more supplies, more prisoners, and food. And they continued to work hard to establish a colony. Now, one of the problems was that the prison guards didn't want to work side by side with the prisoners. So Arthur Phillip said, okay, I'll make some of the prisoners leaders and motivate other prisoners to work hard so they can become leaders or landowners. That'll help. So he started to do this system, and criminals and prisoners in Australia soon realized that if they worked hard enough, they could get their own land and have their own farm and have a better life than they would have had in England, where they would have starved and been too poor. So a lot of prisoners actually chose to stay in Australia. And even other settlers from England that weren't prisoners decided to come for these same opportunities that they hoped to achieve. And eventually, these colonies started to expand. There ended up being 5 colonies in total across Australia. They even brought sheep to make sheep farming happening and to graze on the land there. So they introduced sheep to Australia. Now, eventually there was too many men because prisoners were more often men than women. So there were too many men and not enough women. So in order to have a thriving colony, they needed more families and kids to be born. So they decided to pay a bunch of poor women in England to go to this new colony, which they did. And so this colony grew and definitely started to prosper. However, it didn't prosper for everyone. Even though Arthur Phillip said that they must work together with Aborigines, the native peoples there, he said that even if you killed one of them, you would be hanged. So you must find peace with them. However, this wasn't successful. Criminals still looted and stole things from Aborigines. And unfortunately, by the time all 5 colonies were established in Australia, the Aborigine population went from the original 300,000 by estimates to less than 80,000 people. So unfortunately, this new colonization of Australia was not pleasant for everyone, as is usually the case. That's it for chapter 24. I'll see you next time for chapter 25. Bye-bye.